Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be moderating the strategic dialogue, supply chains, human rights, and businesses. My name is Sara Enright. I'm the Director of Sustainability Collaborations at BSR, which is a global network and consultancy focused on sustainability. At BSR, I work with several private sector-led collaborations focused on human rights across supply chains. For instance, the Global Business Coalition Against Human Trafficking, which is a BSR collaboration that harnesses the power of business across sectors to prevent modern slavery across supply chains and to support survivors. Today, we're going to be discussing the impacts of COVID-19 on the workers of supply chains, focusing on businesses' ability to prevent labor violations and other human rights abuses during this challenging time. We want to examine how current trends may impact our ability to fulfill the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly SDG 8, to achieve full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men by 2030. Supply chains that have been highly optimized and cut lean for just-in-time delivery are proving to be fragile in the face of this disruption. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues, global economies stumble, and already disadvantaged groups such as women, youth, and migrants fall further into poverty. We're witnessing profound changes that will surely mark the next decade for business. I'm excited to dig into these issues with our speakers today. So I'm going to open up now to our speakers. We're encouraged by Concordia to consider this discussion like a dinner conversation that we would have at a dinner party. And I can't think of a more exciting group of people to have around the dinner table. So I'd like to ask each of you to introduce yourself in turn, your name, your role, your organization, and then a quick answer to a question. What's keeping you up at night right now related to labor rights and worker welfare across global supply chains? What's your greatest concern? All right, and I'm going to start with Anbinh from Walmart.
Thank you so much, Sara. It's great to be with you here today. I'm really excited about all that Concordia is doing and the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. As you mentioned, my name is Anbinh Phan. I'm from Walmart. I'm the Director of Global Government Affairs, focused on supply chain and trade. And what that entails is working with our global sourcing and responsible sourcing teams on issues around combating forced labor and advocating for responsible recruitment. We are members of groups such as the Leadership Group for Responsible Recruitment and the Seafood Task Force, industry initiatives that advance these objectives, of which I provide advice and counsel on how to engage governments. As we know, all these issues are multi-stakeholder, and it's important to develop and build an enabling environment to advance the objectives and to address the issues that we're concerned about today. And to answer your question, Sara, there's a lot to be concerned about and a lot that's on our minds these days, but several things that are definitely top of mind to me are just the plight of the migrant worker. As you had mentioned, supply chains are shifting to a variety of factors, including trade, health. And so the great supply of migrant workers, the information they're receiving, their vulnerabilities, their voice, their access to basic necessities, healthcare, food, etc. That's definitely on top of mind. And also, safety of workers in factories continues to be building safety, but also health amidst the COVID-19 crisis. And something that there are solutions for, but we all need to work on as a global community is really the concept of the digital divide. It's so important for workers to have access to information, to have ability to express concerns and complaints, to get information that they need in real time, given the changes that are happening in our economy today. And so although 2/3 of the world does have access to smartphones, how are we able to leverage that technology? How are they able to get real-time information? How are they able to issue complaints or to those who may have ability to remediate? So those are some concerns on top of mind. I look forward to the conversation today. Thanks.
Thank you, Anbinh. Anna from PMI.
Yes, hello, good morning and good afternoon from Lausanne in Switzerland. My name is Anna Kletsidou. I work at Philip Morris International. I'm head of social sustainability and human rights. I'm very happy to participate in this virtual panel discussion and share some of PMI's programs and the challenges we are facing when it comes to managing our supply chain risks. Now, Sara, to your question, so since many years we have focused on farming practices, because we have identified that child labor in tobacco growing is a major concern for us within the industry, and I would also say across the agricultural sector. We source tobacco from over 335,000 tobacco farmers, which are spread in 24 countries. They are mostly smallholder farmers growing less than 2 hectares and often located in low and medium income countries. We have an advantage is that we have direct contracts with the vast majority of them, ourselves directly or through our third-party suppliers, meaning that for over 90% of the tobacco we purchase, we know exactly where it comes from. This relationship enabled us in 2011 to put in place our agricultural labor practices program, clear requirements for the farmers, a very comprehensive monitoring system with field technicians that visit the farms 5 times a year to not only to control the tobacco that is grown, the good quality, but to make sure that practices are environmentally sound and that we monitor the conditions of the farms that are aligned with our standards. Today, the proportion of the child labor issues among farmers, it's around 1%. The COVID pandemic and all the measures, the lockdowns, the school closures, we are afraid that could lead to an increase in child labor prevalence. So although we have a very clear target to eliminate child labor in our tobacco supply chain by 2025, we are doing everything we can to achieve it. But this is clearly our key concern.
Thank you, Anna. I'd like to turn to Cherie Blair. Please introduce yourself.
I've been for over 40 years a lawyer. I've always believed that the lawyers should not think in silos, and in particular, they should always be conscious of the human rights implication of what they do, which is easy when you're in a traditional human rights field, but I think it's equally important in the commercial and business world. I'm now chair of my own law firm called Omnia Strategy, which I set up specifically to do what we call the law plus. So it's about, yes, it's about the law, but it's also the law in its context and how can you resolve and even avoid disputes with a smart approach to your business practices. What's concerning me at the moment? I'm concerned that the world could slip backwards because of COVID. I say that in relation to 2 things. One, taking a legal point, the whole question of non-payment and force majeure clauses in contracts. Suddenly, across the world, contracts are being cancelled. And who are the worst affected by that? I'm afraid it's vulnerable workers. And who are those vulnerable workers? Overwhelmingly, they're women. And I think in particular, for example, in the factories and the garment factories in Bangladesh, where overnight, household names in the UK cancelled contracts without a thought for the implication that has on the women and all the people whose food comes from the work they do in those factories. But I also think it has another impact as well, and that's an impact actually in every part of the supply chain, including the part that's in London or in Switzerland or in New York. And that is whether the burden of the impact of what's happened with COVID, and in particular the double shift, has put much more pressure on women workers than on male workers, and in particular on those who work part-time, who are more vulnerable to being picked out for redundancy, and those who work full-time, who recent research, for example, has found that women are still doing twice as much, at least twice as much of the childcare and the caring and housework roles, while still trying to manage their full-time jobs. So I don't want to see the clock being put back to old attitudes that we thought we'd abolished in the 21st century, whether about the role of women in the workforce or indeed about responsible business. And we have to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you for that. Ian from Elevate.
Sure. So thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody. So I'm Ian Spaulding, CEO of Elevate, calling in from Hong Kong. So it's a little late my time. So what's keeping me up besides this call is a number of different things that I think have been mentioned. But maybe before I answer the question, I'll just remind people who Elevate is and what we do. So we're a professional services firm. We have about 500 people around the world. We're mainly in Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, China, Turkey, et cetera. And we work on behalf of the private sector to evaluate and improve a lot of the supply chains from many of the companies on this panel as well. And I think we have some unique insights into what's working and what's not working. And there is a lot that's just not working. To be quite honest, a lot of the folks on this panel and companies that they work for are actually some of the leaders in the industry that have done a lot of really interesting and innovative, impactful work. But unfortunately, it doesn't represent the majority of businesses. And we continue to see a private sector who is struggling in light of COVID, who is doing practices that, quite honestly, I think we were all a little surprised by. For example, I'll just give you a couple which are weaved into some of the remarks that were mentioned. Vulnerable workers. In Myanmar, we're dealing with a case right now where COVID happened. Workers basically were unsure about ultimately whether or not they were get paid when the factory shut down. Management was not familiar with how to negotiate, how to do social dialogue. As a result, they call the police, people get arrested, they get put in jail. Now all of a sudden they use this as an excuse to blacklist union employees, et cetera. In other instances, we see factories that were really struggling before COVID, that when COVID came into be, then all of their buyers just used it as an excuse to cancel orders or to negotiate significant price concessions. So I think while I think everyone is coming to terms with the impact of COVID on their own business in retail worlds, particularly in North America and Europe, I think we've seen dramatic impact to factories and workers on the ground, just to echo some of the points that were made before.
Thank you, and pointing out already some steps that companies should be looking to take immediately to protect workers across their supply chain. Thank you for that, Ian. And Steve from Winrock.
Sure, thank you, Sarah. My name is Steve Brunn. I lead private sector engagement for Winrock International. We're an international NGO, very broad-based, covering agriculture, environment, human rights, education, empowerment. But we also work in the U.S. on entrepreneurship, community development, sustainable agriculture, and food systems. In the human rights space, Winrock is USAID's largest implementer of counter-trafficking programs. That's inclusive of forced labor and the various challenges associated with labor conditions for migrant workers. We implement projects globally, but the majority of our work is in South and Southeast Asia. To answer the question of what is most concerning to me right now, and I know we're going to get into this and many have mentioned it already, but it has to be COVID-19. And we are conducting research on this on an ongoing basis, and we're seeing massive rates of unemployment for migrant workers, and also that these workers are the most susceptible to COVID and the least likely to actually have access to healthcare if they do actually have COVID. So that's a major concern, and I will talk in a little bit about what we can do to address that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'd love to open up the conversation a little bit. We're going to start to dig into some of these questions. My first question for the group is.
I think
Sarah and I introduce ourselves as well.
Oh.
If Genevieve,
yeah, I'm so sorry, Genevieve, please.
And Lisa too. I think we both.
Please, Genevieve, introduce yourself.
All right.
Hold on.
All right, sure. I'm Genevieve Taft-Vazquez. I'm Global Director for Workplace Accountability at the Coca-Cola Company. Our department oversees the implementation of our human rights policy and our supplier guiding principles as well. I've really enjoyed tuning in over the last few days, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. These are a lot of familiar faces that we've worked with, so it's great to be here. I have tried to snuggle up close to a wall so that you don't see any of my children streaking in the background, but no promises on the audio. We'll see. In terms of just on the quick question about what's keeping us up, I think one of the challenges with COVID-19 is that we are continuing to see the impacts unfold. And so part of what worries me is just with these compounding catastrophes is the risk and the ripple effects that are still unfolding that we don't have a clear line of sight on. And we all know, and what's been mentioned so far already, is just kind of the disproportional impact of the pandemic on vulnerable populations. And so when we look at supply chains like ours, that's going to be deeper in the supply chain, in the informal sector, where that might enter. Cherie Blair mentioned women in the informal sector are particularly vulnerable. And then a lot of people have mentioned migrant workers. And just to kind of outline why I think particularly in terms of global supply chains, why migrant workers are especially vulnerable is, they may be facing discrimination. They may be having lack of information due to language barriers or cultural barriers. They may be living in dormitories next to plants that have close quarters, so put them at greater risk of infection. They may be facing travel restrictions. They may be the ones to lose their job first, and that loss of livelihood might impact their ability to get home. I've seen, and just the ripple effects of this, I've seen, studies or estimates in particular markets that 80% drop in remittances because of loss of livelihood. So I think what we're seeing is just we're going to be seeing huge ripple effects for a long time to come. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Genevieve. And since I missed you on that last one, I'm going to start with you on this next question.
But has Lisa introduced herself?
My goodness, Lisa, please.
No worries, Sarah. No worries. Okay, so last to the dinner party, but hopefully not least here. So Lisa Manley, I'm the Vice President of Sustainability at Mars. My team and I look after our global human rights agenda, and that means working across a number of supply chains. So working from cocoa and sugarcane for supply chains that feed into our chocolate and treat business, and then supply chains like fish for things that feed into our pet food business, and plenty of others where there are rich and robust, I think, challenges and opportunities with regards to human rights. In terms of the things that are keeping me up at night, I think there's probably a trio, and we've touched on elements of each one of these things that I think are of greatest concern. I mean, first of all, this has always been a challenging and a complex area for business. And the vulnerabilities are deepening, increasing significantly as a result of the COVID context. So from forced labor to child labor to poverty, all of those vulnerabilities are becoming much more acute. And the deepening of vulnerabilities is happening at the same time that our visibility is lessened. So we're not able to be as visibly aware of what's happening, either in our direct tier 1 supply chains or at origin. And so some of the hidden truths, like forced labor, are becoming harder to see and harder to fix as well. And then a couple of folks have already mentioned the fact that, while expectations for business are increasing, the unfortunate reality is that there are business practices that in some cases are not stepping up for the increased expectations. So, whether it's cutting contracts, cutting costs, changing terms of relationships, all of those things are unfortunately happening right now. And again, deepening the vulnerability to people all around the world.
Thank you, Lisa. So we've already heard some really good examples of how supply chains are becoming a little bit less capable of protecting the human rights of their employees. We're seeing that suppliers that are facing increased pressure to produce during the pandemic may be actually exacerbating human rights issues across their value chains. And we're also seeing that workers who are furloughed and laid off around the world are also facing increased vulnerability. So I'm curious, from starting with the business speakers, what actions are you taking today to protect your workforce across your supply chain in response to these compounding issues? I'm going to start with Genevieve from Coca-Cola, please.
Great. Well, I was going to mention that, last year, actually, the Coca-Cola company updated our company purpose statement to refresh the world, make a difference. And as somebody who's focused on human rights, I loved having that, the last three words of make a difference added in there. And just with the current pandemic and the social justice movements, I think it's all more important that companies like us reaffirm what it means to be a good global citizen, and engaging with employees, the workforce, the extended workforce, suppliers, communities in that commitment. And so when I think about what companies can do, I kind of think about, or what we as a company can do, I think about it in 3 different areas. So what is it, what kind of support can we be lending to, what kind of protections should we be putting in place? And then 3, what kind of expectations should we be setting for suppliers as well? So making sure that we're continuing to hold them accountable. So just on the first one, I think it's important when we talk about what support we can lend is that companies think about that we are in it together with our supply chain. Right. So we are not successful as a company if our suppliers are not successful. We're not successful if our retail customers are not successful, or if our employees or our workforce is not successful. And so I think bringing that mindset to bear is really important. And so to that end, our procurement function had put together kind of a COVID response team to understand what do suppliers need right now, what's going to continue supply chain continuity piece. And that could be little things around ensuring timely payment of invoices to ensure cash liquidity, or to working with our banking partners to unlock $1 billion in terms of supplier financing programs. So I think, and in addition, it can also be charitable giving as well. So our foundation has focused on the pandemic, has given away $55 million to communities in terms of dealing with COVID-19. So that's on kind of the lending, or the lending our support. I think on the putting protections in place is really important, is, obviously to lead by example. And so, making sure that we are keeping our workforce, our employees safe by ensuring that we have adequate PPE, that it's being used, that you have additional cleaning routines, that we're minimizing contact on person-to-person contact, whether it's on the delivery side or spacing out shifts, so that when one person is coming in to do their next shift, that they're not coming into direct contact. So putting in those kind of protections in place, so we're protecting to the extent possible our own workforce. And then this point around making sure that our suppliers know that we're going to keep them accountable for their actions. So it is not a time to be saying, oh, we're not going to do our due diligence anymore, because really the workforce is at the heart of this issue. And so we have, while on a typical basis, on an annual basis, we will do about 2,500 independent audits at supplier sites against our human rights policy and supplier guiding principles. We have adapted that to do virtual assessments. And so ensuring that we are reinforcing this message that due diligence continue, that we stand by our policies, we expect them to uphold these values, and we're going to continue to do the due diligence. I think all of those things are really important. So it's not just one thing that a company can do, but it's figuring out what are the combination of levers that we can bring to bear. And I was reading a recent report, I think it was the Gates Foundation, that talked about progress is possible, but it's not inevitable, right? So we need to make sure that we're continuing to push where we can to address this situation.
Thank you. I'm curious to hear from Anbinh.
Yeah, sure, Sarah. Thanks, Genevieve. I really like to just build on the great points that Genevieve stated. First and foremost, there's a system that we have in place that we run. We have our best business practices, we have our supplier codes of conduct, and we work with our suppliers to minimize disruption due to the COVID-19 impacts and to supply chain shocks. We really engage with them, and also work, our responsible sourcing team works to identify where there may be risks or challenges and vulnerabilities in supply chain, and we work with them to mitigate those challenges. So everything that we've put in place before the pandemic, we need to continue those good practices and continue that ongoing due diligence using the tools and remediation that we have. Recognizing at this juncture, there are new challenges and there are changes and disruptions in our economy, in our retail markets. It's important also, this point is where we discuss engaging different stakeholders, whether it's civil society or government, to address the needs and the new laws and regulations that are coming up and the particular vulnerabilities for groups such as women and migrant workers. I also find, so we have our run and our engagement, but I've found that our Walmart Foundation has been very strategic in how they've also used the philanthropic capabilities to address these particular issues. looking at where there are particular vulnerabilities in the system. So whether that's concerns about food shortage or health, access to health and safety, how we can implement and enhance those particular activities. In addition, we realize that our work goes farther when we go together. So it's critical that we also work with organizations that are also providing assistance. I see Steve from Winrock and work of USAID. How can the private and the public sector come together to address these issues that just aren't only about business, but are about communities and about societies and about development and development prospects and about women in the workforce, et cetera, and their opportunities. So there's definitely risk in the system, but there's also opportunity for us to advocate for in this moment of openness in some ways to change, to advocate for some of those environmental, social governance metrics that we've been trying to advance. Also opportunity for us to collaborate in new ways and innovative ways to provide tools and services that have not been provided in the past.
Thank you for using this unusual time as an opportunity for innovation. Anna, would you like to make a comment?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Sarah. Well, I fully agree what Genevieve and Anbinh said before me. So our first priority was first and utmost to ensure the security and the safety of our people, providing the right PPEs and the right conditions, of course, to do their job. And we have been engaging since the beginning of this crisis with the suppliers, following the effects in our supply chain and in our agriculture supply chain. So we have clear requirements. We have responsible sourcing principles. We will continue having those requirements towards all our suppliers. And since last year, we have been implementing a suppliers due diligence program. It's called STEP. It is based on a risk management approach that helps us identify suppliers' potential environmental and social risks. And based on that risk, we then evaluate their suppliers' performance in addressing those risks. And we do audits, questionnaires, desktop reviews, on-site audits, and we continue doing those. Of course, what is extremely important is when gaps are identified, we are collaborating, we are working with the suppliers to put action plans in place. And I think this is very important. Now, where we identify, however, potentially higher risk of the COVID, it is in our agriculture supply chain due to the vulnerability of smallholder farmers that I mentioned before. And here we had to take a lot of actions. We had to rethink the whole way that we operate, adapting our monitoring techniques, reducing the visits, or canceling them where full lockdowns were applied. We try to be creative, doing virtually from contracting farmers to trainings and even monitoring. Unfortunately, a lot of our remediation actions and initiatives that were ongoing on the ground were also impacted, and we had to redesign them, reallocate funds. Just to give you an example, we had the funded, PMI-funded childcare centers that were closed, and we reallocated the funds to deliver food baskets instead. So we were trying to find ways to support during this crisis. Now, if I think what we will do in the future, and we already started doing it, that we are strengthening our work in improving the capacity of the tobacco farming communities to achieve a decent standard of living. I'm sure you have done this exercise, all of our co-panelists here, but when we analyze the root causes of all our human rights and sustainability strategies, poverty is certainly the greatest single force that drives children into the work, that leads to poor and unsafe working conditions, to discrimination, to gender stereotypes. And this is the area where we decided to canalize our efforts and achieve long-term improvements in the livelihoods of the farmers. So with this in mind, we set a goal that all farmers in our tobacco supply chain achieve a living income by 2025. And a living income, by living income, I mean that the farmer's annual net income is enough to provide all essentials like food, water, housing, education, healthcare, some extra money for unexpected expenses, and this for all the household. So we believe that this work will make the farmers more resilient to adverse conditions like climate shocks, like floods and droughts, and more resilient to this uncertainty in the supply and demand of agricultural commodities. But most importantly, I think by really achieving a living income, we consider this as a key enabler to eliminating child labor, to eliminating all the other labor abuses that we are currently facing in our tobacco supply chain.
So that's addressing some of the root causes of the poverty and human rights abuses. Thank you. And Lisa, I'd love to hear your take as well.
Yeah, so thanks, Sarah. Maybe I'll zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about, from our perspective, we think that it's, really time for a new normal with regard to supply chain management. And when I talk about a new normal, it's really sort of a movement beyond commodities. So for too long, business has been, buying based on a commodity sort of mindset. So buying on quality specifications and price with little focus on the impacts to people and the planet that we share. And I think that when we think about sort of the weakest links in our supply chains, they're not being tended to when we focus on commodity buying. So one of the things that we've done previous to this current pandemic is we've brought our procurement team together with our sustainability team. So our chief sustainability officer is also our chief procurement officer. And the sort of the mindset there is that we've got to change the way that our buyers think about and act within their roles as procurement officers. And so that business structure, we think, is really critical for our ability to deepen our impact on the planet and on the people that sit throughout our value chain. Second thing that we're doing, and I know a number of you are as well, is sort of flexing our advocacy muscles a little bit more. So we are talking more about the critical need for human rights due diligence. We are talking more about the importance of decent wages and living wages. We're talking more about gender equality. And when I say we're talking about those things, I mean we're talking about them in political circles. And that I think is incredibly important. And then on the philanthropy side, Mars is a maybe a funny family-owned business where the investments that the family makes are directly back into the business, but we don't have a foundation. But for instances like what we're dealing with right now, we have been able to gather resources that we're putting into a number of philanthropic investments that are focused on sort of gender-based solutions to this pandemic. So we've been very choiceful in our collaboration with CARE, looking after the vulnerabilities of women and girls in some of our key supply chains. So some work in West Africa on cocoa, some work in Thailand on fish, some work in India on our mint supply chain, where our focus is gender first, women first, in terms of gender-based communications, gender-based interventions as well. And, we're learning with this engagement. So, one of the things that we want to do through the philanthropic giving and through our partnership with CARE is make sure that we're sharing sort of how it does matter, what we can do differently when we are responding to a crisis like the one that we're all facing right now, if we put women first.
Thank you. I'd like to open up also to our civil society representatives and our advisors. And feel free to make a comment on the question, but also ask any questions that you might have of our corporate speakers. So starting with Cherie. You're on mute. There we go.
absolutely agree, by the way, what Lisa of Mars was saying. I wanted to say a couple of things. You know, we cannot have a sustainable recovery from COVID based on a vulnerable and unsustainable living for the weakest in our supply chain. I mean, it's obviously, you think it obviously isn't going to work. The best companies, like the ones we've heard today, realize that. And I think what's been interesting about what you've been saying is that there's a different approach when you're looking at due diligence. You're not just looking traditionally in the way the business did about legal risks or others. You're actually looking at the shoes of the right holder. You're putting yourself in the position of the people upon whom you're having an impact. And in your supply chains, of course, they are the people who are populating that supply chain. And when you look at it from that way, then, you know, a company like Mars is not going to suddenly cut off the funds and say, because we can and because we can't sell our goods, we're just not going to pay you. But the reality, of course, is that unfortunately that isn't what's happening in many parts of the world. And I think sometimes businesses, the lawyers help in that, because they can use legal entitlements in a way that doesn't recognize the wider impact of enforcing those legal entitlements actually has on the world, and indeed on the reputation of a company. And I think sometimes I find in the legal practices I do, that you've got companies who have great statements and are doing all sorts of things on this side, and yet when it comes to their legal disputes, it's like they turn rabid, and it's you know, all right, we're doing it, kill, kill, kill. So a joined up approach. I love the idea that your head of sustainability is also your head of procurement. This is a really important way of making sure we have a joined up response. The other thing I wanted to touch on is that this is not all about companies. There's governments too. And governments are involved in this in one of two ways. In one way, there are governments who, because of in their reaction to what's happened with COVID, have actually minimized or taken away protections from the workers. You know, and we need to have companies saying this is not the way to ensure a recovery. And so lobbying governments, being an advocate for fair practices backed by law is very important. I think the other thing we're also seeing, of course, and we're seeing it very much both in the UN and also in the EU, is that the soft laws that we've been seeing before, like the UN Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights, are hardening, particularly in relation to modern slavery and supply chains, into more hard obligations. And I think, Anna, you're from Switzerland, so you know what's happening in Switzerland at the moment, the consultation that's going on there, which has been driven very much by civil society, and let the government really, and indeed the companies in Switzerland, rather taken aback about what is happening. And at the moment, the EU is engaged in a consultation, and they are they're looking generally at non-financial reporting, but they are looking at new laws in relation to what large companies, like the companies on this conversation, are going to be doing. So governments can be proactive, and supporting the good companies, I think, is a good thing, leads to a level playing field. But there are some governments who are using this as an excuse to crack down on the vulnerable. And there, the vulnerable need the voices of business to tell government that that's not actually what they need in order to survive the crisis, that they don't want to build a sustainable future on the backs of the most vulnerable. So they're my comments for what it's worth.
Thank you for that. Ian, would you like to add anything?
The only thing, yeah, I think that was great. I like the fact that we have the private sector advocating for publicly in more legislation or more responsibility of government to take action. Because again, one of the things that I keep seeing is I see, you know, two different worlds, right? A world of the private sector who's done amazing work and really impactful things, and then the reality. And it's not to scale. And for example, I'll just give you another one. 20 years ago, we were pointing out issues of Sri Lankan workers paying $3,000, $4,000 US in the Middle East, in Qatar and Oman and Jordan and UAE. And the private sector heard about it and they did nothing. And it only was when the US government came around in Malaysia during the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement and began to negotiate to actually push for changes in laws in Thailand with the tip reports, et cetera, that led to now a crowdswell of activities from the private sector. And it wasn't just leadership companies like Apple and others who were already good work. It was everyone began to look, to dig deep, to realize that they needed to solve the issue and begin to talk about structural reform. And relating to that was that it was a shared cost. It was a shared responsibility, but shared cost as well. When we evaluated factories in Malaysia 4 or 5 years ago, pointing out similar challenges for Bangladeshi workers or Nepalese workers in Malaysia, the factory response is, well, this is expensive. And if we were to comply, then we're no longer competitive. So we have to go to our customers and ask for their support. And the customers in North America and Europe said, no, that's your obligation. And so the issue doesn't get solved. But today,
oh dear,
What a cliffhanger.
indeed. All right, I might, in the meantime, while we're waiting, Steve, let's jump to you.
Yeah, I could fill in, and just getting into some specifics on COVID-19. In my introduction, I had mentioned that we're conducting some research in the field with some of our bilateral programs in Nepal, Bangladesh, and Cambodia. So just to give you some facts and figures about what we're seeing. So this research is focused on return migrants, so migrants that have had to come back to their home countries due to COVID. And so within that population, we're seeing unemployment rates in Bangladesh and Nepal specifically of 85 to 90%. We're finding that most workers are not receiving any support from the government or the private sector. Most of these workers are ready to remigrate, but there's just so much uncertainty. They don't know when or if they'll have the opportunity to do that again. And in the meantime, they're out of the system and they don't have income. And those are the workers who have actually been able to return. It's an even worse situation for the workers who are actually trapped in their destination countries that can't get back, that are now considered illegal in some cases and are being cracked down on by authorities. They have no help, no support, and they're in this hostile situation. So our approach to addressing these issues so far is to find ways of getting information to these workers about COVID, how to prevent COVID, how they can seek help, how they can seek support, connecting them with resources, and utilizing technological communication to provide that information, and also utilizing our existing networks in the ground. Because the way that we work is in each country is we have a pretty vast network of local NGOs that are in these specific communities. And even though we're restricted from engaging in the communities right now due to COVID, we can leverage these local NGOs and local civil society. So that's kind of what we're seeing and some of what we're doing to address this issue. And just a quick plug, tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Eastern, we're hosting a private roundtable to discuss more about this research, some of what we've seen work. We want to hear what others are experiencing and hear what approaches they're taking as well, and really getting into the specifics. So that's 8 a.m. Tomorrow morning. If you're interested in that, feel free to message me within the Concordia app, or contact anyone from Concordia and they can make the connection.
Thank you, Steve. Would anybody like to respond to any comments that have been made so far? And Ian, please feel free to finish your comment off as well.
Yeah, I would. Well, the one topic that I wanted to raise, just because I know this is all about forced labor. A lot of it is vulnerable workers and forced labor. But one of the things that is keeping me up that I wasn't able to talk about before is this, and it links to the role of the U.S. government and what they've done relating to Uyghurs in China. And I think it's important to mention that because, again, here is a great example where a vulnerable workforce, a vulnerable population is ultimately we now see massive changes in the way the private sector is dealing with sourcing in China and beginning to dig deep on it. And it has come in large part through activist groups who pointed out these issues, the media, but also from government who have actually changed laws or beginning to talk about changing laws, et cetera. And we see tremendous activity happening where the private sector is beginning to rethink a lot of their sourcing practices, how they can drive traceability, et cetera, which might lead to some emerging practices that would be good in terms of addressing these issues, but it also might actually drive other issues underground. And we can talk about that a little bit later. It's a sensitive topic, but it's one that we've been working on very closely in China.
Very good. Any responses?
Well, I just on that, I know we're going to maybe hopefully talk a little bit about partnerships, but I think what Ian is talking about really underscores the importance of having, all sectors involved in, moving things forward. So, designing with equity, but having the government supporting that, having those critical stakeholders who are going to be advocates for vulnerable populations, and then having business bring to bear what they can as well. So.
Thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I wanted to bring in a question that's been sent to us from the audience. We've heard a couple of mentions of how contract agreements are being renegotiated, and this participant wants to know how do companies determine what are fair and reasonable renegotiations and which are exploitative? How are some of our corporate participants navigating that challenge? Anybody would like to take that one? Please, Cherie.
Noticed that question, and I did want to say, honestly, guys, it's not that difficult to know what's reasonable and what's exploitative. It is not reasonable to say, well, I'm sorry, because we're having problems at our end, we are going to make you the poorest in our supply chain. We're just not going to pay you. I mean, how anyone thinks that is a reasonable response is actually beyond me. And the tragedy is, as we've heard, is that those companies who don't do that, often don't get the credit for it. And, if we don't build a level playing field here, if we don't actually have some ground rules, then it's very difficult, because the good companies are doing it fine, but you also have to bring up those who are less keen to do that, because otherwise you're just undercutting, and so Mars stops using a particular factory that's using child labor, but somebody else selling somebody else somewhere else just says, well, that's fine by us, and we carry on. And so you're just completing the compounding the issue, and it goes back to what I say you have to look at this when you're looking about your diligence and everything else. You have to look at it through the eyes of the people that you're working with. It has to be a very people-centric approach, and it cannot just be driven by the idea that we are maximizing our profit, because in the end, as we know, reputationally, maximizing profit can lead to a catastrophic collapse in confidence in your brand.
And I'll jump in. So, I think, Mars is very focused on a series of principles as we think about our relationships with suppliers and others throughout our value chain. And one of them is mutuality. So as we think about mutuality, we've been around for 100+ years. And, part of what has supported that longevity is that we've been trying to build mutual relationships with our suppliers. So we can't win unless our suppliers are winning as well. And the transition that I mentioned with regard to sort of aligning procurement and sustainability means that we're looking more deeply at the role of things like long-term contracts and the role of paying a premium for sustainable products. But within today's context, we're also exploring within our procurement teams, is there a role for cash transfer? So if we know that there is a true deepening of vulnerability in some of our critical supply chains? Do we have a responsibility to help in some way with the transfer of cash to vulnerable farmers, for example? Do we have a responsibility with flexible terms with some of our suppliers as well? And those are all very active, conversations that are happening now, have been happening throughout, sort of the COVID context, but always with sort of this central focus on mutuality.
Thank you for that. So I would like to move on to a discussion about partnerships. We've heard just in this last conversation about, the reality on the ground is getting harder for workers by the day, even as companies put very thoughtful practices in place. So what is the role of partnerships to help bridge that gap? Are there tried and true partnership practices that are working? Are there innovative models that might be showing some promise? Give us some insight into what we should be keeping our eye on. And I'd like to actually start with some of the speakers on the panel who are partners to companies on this. So maybe starting with Steve from Winrock.
Sure, thank you, Sarah. We're very fortunate to work with almost every organization and company represented on this call today. And our approach to partnership in this space, and I think the solutions that are needed, just speaking at a high level for a second, is about empowerment of the different stakeholders that exist in these supply chains or value chains. So thinking about, what does government need? What does business need? What do workers need? What do customers need? What do all of these entities need? And then how do they hold each other accountable once they're empowered with the technology, the information that they need to advocate for their rights or to better monitor their supply chains, et cetera. I think one great example of this is the current collaboration that we have with Ian and his Elevate team on an application that we're developing in Bangladesh called SafeStep. And the purpose of SafeStep is to help provide more transparency and accountability into the migration process. So I think, as many of you know, Bangladesh is a major source country for migrant workers around the world. But often these workers are paying massive fees. They are being promised things that never come to fruition in terms of getting a totally different job when they get to country, not getting the amount that they were promised, getting major fees subtracted from their pay once they get into country, and a number of other abuses and forms of exploitation. So the tool that we're developing has several different features. There's components that are related to worker education to help them make good decisions before they select an opportunity for migration, and then prepares them for the actual migration process. So it's a step-by-step process as they prepare for migration. It empowers them, it gives them the information that they need about what their rights are, what the appropriate process should be. And then it gives them tools to support that. So it has a calculator that enables them to understand the financial implications of migration, which is one thing through our research we identified that these workers need. They need to be able to understand how to weigh the costs and benefits of making this migration decision. It also provides them with the ability to collect the documents that they need and store them securely in a digitized format. So Diginex is our blockchain partner that's helping us with that. And so these tools or the storage can help with things like identification, contracts, receipts that they have, all the things that they need to, again, advocate for themselves if anything were to go wrong. And then lastly, there's a grievance mechanism that enables them to report issues that are happening throughout the process. Again, from pre-decision through departure and through to when they're in country. So any issues that come up, then there's a grievance mechanism process that Elevate has a lot of experience implementing and is taking the lead on that portion. So this is, we're testing portions of it right now. It's due to go out for a bigger beta test in early next year. This is funded by the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. We've been getting a lot of interest in it. A recruiting agency in Bangladesh just contacted us this week and wants to send 10,000 workers to Saudi Arabia using our app to provide greater transparency and accountability. So I think this is an example of a tool that empowers the different stakeholders, gives them the information that they need to see what's happening with workers, to see what's happening with their own migration process. If I'm I take the example of being the migrant worker, and also enables accountability. So it enables the employer to hold the recruiting agency accountable. It enables the worker, in some cases, to hold the recruiting agency accountable. And so it becomes a much more virtuous cycle than the system that exists today, which is highly exploitive to that migrant worker.
Thank you. Partnerships and a role for technology here as well. Ian, would you like to add to that?
No, I mean, we're optimistic for those things. I think we've been involved in a lot of really cool, interesting public-private partnerships that have worked out really well. The only thing I could add maybe is just to consider that sometimes the partnerships that we see are very much like public funding or grant funding that goes to support private sector initiatives. And then international companies work with local partners like factories, but it often is not done in true collaboration with the local factory partners. So the only thing I would just encourage is, as companies think about partnership, it really is, embodying the full sense of what that means and engaging with those local stakeholders. Because sometimes I feel like I'm hearing on the ground factory feeling like they're being required to partner, but it's not a real partnership because the power dynamics still rests with ultimately the buyer. And I think that maybe a little bit of recognizing that there's a voice that is often muted in these partnership discussions, and that voice needs to be a little bit more, heard. So anyway.
Thank you. Cherie, any additions?
Most of it's been touched on. I would only go back to the necessity to also get governments involved. I mean, so much more could be done if you actually had state support, both in the individual states and also through regional and indeed, the UN. We need to do more to set standards internationally and then police them and hold people to account. And companies aren't the conscience keepers of the whole world. Governments really do have a role in this, and some governments are participating and other governments are perfectly happy to turn a blind eye, and we need to do more to open their eyes.
Thank you for that. Anbinh, would you like to make a comment?
Yes.
Yes.
Sorry.
Brought up partnership.
We'll help you next time.
Okay, thank you. When you brought up partnership, I was really excited because that's such an approach that we take at Walmart. Although we are a large retailer operating in 27 countries, serving 240 million customers a week, there are so many supply chains that we are involved in. And we've really taken the approach of engaging not only our philanthropic arm, but also in terms of advocacy and our own supply chains. So we can impact change in the assortment that we have and our sustainability practices and even engaging our suppliers. But there are some issues that are so large when you're looking at issues around the responsible recruitment of migrant workers or looking at issues that particularly affect the opacity of the seafood sector. It's really important to have groups, industry initiatives where we're having the combination of civil society actors, retailers, and suppliers come together to adjust best practices, to look at industry norms, to look at externalities that are impacting the sector and the supply chain, and to develop working solutions. We need the technical experts to really come in and also provide guidance. So we've been involved with the Seafood Task Force, and that has been, the coalition, everyone from Bumblebee to Costco to, our competitors and also our suppliers, Marine Gold. And that has been a way that we've, at least in the Thai seafood sector and now expanding to Vietnam, addressed some of the specific issues there, and has been an effective way to engage the government as well. So we can advance best practices and address industry norms. Now also, we can learn also from the environmental sector on partnerships. The Sustainable Apparel Coalition is particularly effective in providing tools and resources to members so that they're able to hit targets and metrics. That has been through the Higg Index, that has been an admirable way for the sustainability sector to reach targets and go beyond the minimum to reach higher and higher goals. around sustainability. And so I also, it's something that's really important about partnership. We work with International Justice Mission on issues like law enforcement that we, when you're looking at the UN guiding principles, business doesn't have a role necessarily in that space, but so important then to, when you're looking at issues around forced labor, that there is a law, it's a criminal activity. And so how are we looking at prevalence issues? How are we looking at law enforcement? How are we looking at deterrence? So business can partner in areas where we don't have expertise, where we need other partners to drive change, but we can support because we all are working together in an ecosystem. So partnership is so critical, and it also brings best practices and economies of scale to issues that are difficult, challenging, and complex.
Thank you for that. And you hit on something that we've observed at BSR as well, which is when you're participating for the long term in a partnership, it can help you be more resilient because that partnership can continue to focus on what it's designed to work on in your sustainability program while you respond to immediate needs within your organization. So you have at least a side function that's still focusing on the long term while you focus on the short term. Anna, you wanted to make a comment.
Yes, I just wanted to make a very general comment because I think we all here recognize that we are dealing with economic and social issues of such complexity, especially now following the COVID pandemic, that no one sector, be it government, business, civil society, or academia, is able to achieve by itself. This is why I honestly feel we need to overcome the differences and come together to face those common challenges and collaborate, build partnerships, and even in ways that we haven't thought possible before, because it is no longer just about doing less harm, it's actually doing a positive contribution and creating shared value.
Oh, can you still hear me? Okay, good. I couldn't hear you for some reason. Well, I think we're all, here part of the Concordia Summit because we fundamentally believe that partnership is going to take us further and is really critical to kind of achieving the impact that we're looking for. I heard some really important principles. Ian mentioned this kind of the power dynamic. Steve, you mentioned, information being able to drive empowerment. And I think a couple of the other principles that we try to bring to partnerships is transparency, right? So we are open in our communication, we're honest in our communication with our partners. Inclusiveness, so making sure that we are bringing together a wide range of stakeholders, whether it is traditionally marginalized voices or it might be those who are particularly critical of us as companies. Accountability and consistency. And so, Sarah, you kind of mentioned this idea of keeping it focused. Sometimes projects and partnerships start out with a lot of attention and then can kind of get, sidetracked or something. And so making sure that we have those consistent routines and keeping ourselves accountable as well as our partners. And then I might add to that, maybe being persistent. Sometimes collaboration in a multi-stakeholder setting can take a long time, can be challenging, can be messy. But I think they're really important to kind of having the impact that we want. And I think Anbinh had mentioned something like this, like if you want to go, what's the saying? If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that that's really what is important in this. And when we look at partnerships and collaborations, we do that whether it is amongst our industry peers. So that might be with AIM Progress, and I'm looking, Mars, we partner with them through AIM Progress. Ian's group Elevate helps us. We have a regional direct kind of network that Elevate helps us facilitate with that. The Consumer Goods Forum, Walmart will be partnering on some of those work streams, or they may be direct partnerships, understanding where the subject matter experts are, or multi-stakeholder one. And an example of that I think is really exciting and kind of innovative is like the Fair Labor Association, their work in Turkey, looking at landscape approach to agriculture, understanding that migrant workers are going to be moving across commodities. So bringing together companies from different agricultural settings that we may not necessarily naturally align with, it allows us to address issues at a holistic and landscape approach. So I think it's more important than ever that we focus on partnerships.
Thank you for those great examples. And please, Lisa.
Yeah, and just quickly, totally agree that collaboration is absolutely critical for impact and scale on all of the issues that we've been talking about. I think, though, that the catch-22 around partnership is that too many of them are focused on incremental change when what we really need is massive transformation. And I think that there are unfortunately too few examples of collaborations that are truly driving transformational change. One that we're a part of that I do think is sort of uncommon in its focus is the Farmer Income Lab. So, it's our belief that, SDG 1 is the first SDG because until we solve poverty, we're not going to be able to address any of the other sustainability challenges that exist, including all of those that, infringe on people's basic rights. And so this Farmer Income Lab includes business practitioners, it includes NGOs, it includes representatives of governmental organizations as well. So from Mars to AB InBev to Danone to Oxfam, UNDP, the Gates Foundation as well. We have come together over the last 3 years to do some deep research on what works to solve smallholder farmer poverty, and to put that research into action. So using all of the learnings that we've had around what works, what doesn't, pivoting that quickly into practical application in a variety of supply chains, a variety of country contexts, and importantly, and I think that many of us have talked about this, being transparent about everything that we are finding together, experiencing together, being comfortable failing quickly if we are testing things that aren't going to work, but also being transparent about the things that do work so that hopefully it can scale much more broadly than just the few businesses that are represented in the lab today.
Thank you for that. And some of these examples have been mentioned are kind of focused on longer term goals. And I'm actually curious from the corporate speakers who've offered examples, how are these partnerships addressing the immediate needs of the pandemic? Or are they continuing to focus on those long term goals, or are they shifting focus to address pandemic response?
Definitely both from our perspective. So, certainly have a long-term vision in many cases, like where are we wanting to go with, let's say, our anchor partner on human rights, who I know Anna works with as well, with Verite. That's based on sort of long-term vision. But then, we have an anchor partner within sort of our work on unlocking opportunities for women, which is CARE. And, right now, a lot of that work is very focused on crisis response. So, what can we be doing in vulnerable supply chains for vulnerable people right now? And of course, we've got a vision for long-term, engagement on the topic of gender, but very focused right now on the immediate vulnerabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just echo that was true in the project, is really focusing in on recognizing the loss of livelihood and how to support these migrant workers, especially at the farm level, right now, right here. So it is, to Lisa's point, kind of a mix of keeping focused on the longer term goals, not losing sight of that, but ensuring that we're meeting immediate needs.
Great. Thank you. We've got a little bit of time for Q&A from the audience, and you can submit that in the comment section, and those will be raised up to the panelists. But I've got a softball question. This is for Steve. A participant wanted to know the name of the technology that you've developed in partnership with Elevate.
Yeah, it's called Safe Step. So it's Safe Step is one word. If you Google it, you will find it. There's nothing, you can't really see it yet because it's, we're still building in the different functionalities that I've talked about. It is, I think if you actually look in the Android app right now, you can find it. And so you probably can actually play around with it there, but just realize that it's going to be relatively limited functionality right now. You'll see a much more advanced version of it early next year.
If I can just say, I'm excited to learn about this because we have a next in Bahrain and doing something a little bit similar. So this is great. I'd love to bring it together.
Yep, great.
Great.
Happy to.
I'd love to toss a question out to the group, and anybody who'd like to respond can do so. What can we learn from our approach to this year's crisis that could better prepare business for the next crisis? What can we start to build in place that will help us be more resilient? Okay, please, Cherie.
Can I say something? I don't know about learning because I'm not the person to answer that, but I was very interesting what Lisa was saying about being transparent and admitting your failures, because I 100% agree with that. But I wanted to ask her, what do your lawyers say about that? Because, particularly I think in North America, it's often the lawyers who are terrified about admitting that you've done anything that's had adverse consequences for fear of liability. And do you think that the movement we're seeing now of more holding companies to account through legal processes, and we have seen some cases coming, whether it's under the French duty of vigilance or local in Canada, in other places, or do you think that could be a positive? It could be a positive, but could there also be a negative impact in that the lawyers suddenly saying you can't possibly be truthful because it could be held against it in subsequent legal proceedings? I don't know what your view is of that.
Our lawyers are never far away, but thankfully they seem to be more on this journey than against this journey of transparency.
Yeah, but that's absolutely what you need for sure, because the law can be a really effective tool in this, and if we become too defensive, you can't let that stop progress.
If I may add, we have been very transparent with the assessments that are performed in our tobacco supply chain by Control Union. They are a global supply chain auditors. We have been doing that since 2013. And it took us 1 year to agree with the legal department that, yes, we will make those reports available. All the reports are on our website, on pmi.com, 60 pages document with all the findings and the action plan. And we believe that this transparency, sharing the good things, but as well as the challenges that we are facing that are really huge, it is important. So transparency is key. But yes, it took us 1 year to convince the lawyers to do that.
One final question for the group, and anybody who'd like to respond, please do. I'd like to wrap this back around to the Sustainable Development Goals. The pandemic has really thrown us off, and I'm curious, are we optimistic about SDG 8? Are we feeling negative about it? Where do you think we're headed for SDG 8 in particular?
I mean, I am always a glass half full person. So, and I think for any of us that, have built our careers in sustainability, you have to be focused on, what can be possible, what is possible, what we can achieve together. So, I mean, clearly we've been talking, this entire session about the deepening of vulnerabilities, but I will raise my hand on the side of optimism.
Delighted to hear that. Any others? Any counterpoints?
Counterpoint, but I do think it's just that we need to stay vigilant, because I think I don't know, estimates that I've seen is that we've lost 25 years of gains in the last since the pandemic started, and estimates of 70+ million people being put into poverty because of this, and estimated over 100 million people are going to get into extreme hunger by the end of the pandemic. So I just I think together we can kind of make sure that we're staying vigilant and staying on this, but it is something that as we kind of come through the pandemic, we need to make sure that we're putting people in the workforce at the heart of any approach that we are designing.
Excellent.
Thinking about what Lisa shared about massive transformation, that when we're looking at partnership, if we look at incremental and something I learned from Google and the engineers there and their design thinking is what are the 10x things that we can be doing. So Genevieve is pointing out something really critical that can't be ignored. But also, I hope that I'm excited to hear about the tools and the collaborations, a lot of new things I'm learning about, which is exciting to be on a panel where you're learning so many things. And so that's really encouraging, but also to the idea of vigilance, keeping the eyes on. We started off with what keeps you up at night around issues like gender and the digital divide, the need for worker voice tools, and just these human rights concerns. And so how we can apply that design thinking, that 10X, and to push ourselves to do that because it matters. And because, you know, it's, if we don't act, the tide is quite strong in terms of the health issues and the economic issues that our world is facing. So I like to just believe that with that design thinking and with that collaboration, we can make strides.
Thank you so much, Anbinh. And with that, I think that'll be our final words for the panel and a nice closeout and rounding out of the conversation that we've had today. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. This was a fantastic discussion, and I'm just sad that we don't have the rest of the day to continue.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.
Nice to be on a panel with you all.
Thank you.
All the best.